Okay, we are back with another Between the Pages book chat, and today we have fantasy author A.R. Harlow with us, and she's going to talk about her book, We Must Find Her, book one of the Finding Chronicles. So I'm going to turn it over to her now, let her introduce herself. Take it away.
Hey, thank you for having me on your show. So, I'm A.R. Harlow, and I'm the author of We Must Find Her. Um, Outside of writing, I really like to read. I like to play with my two miniature dachshunds, and I like to ride on four wheelers and motorcycles. I live a pretty active life, and I live up in the city.
Oh, cool. So tell us about the book. What's it about?
So, the book is what I classify a fantasy family drama. It deals with a magic school, but not in the way that people would usually associate it. You don't have, bratty teenagers and everything else running the whole show. The stage that's set for this novel is that the parents of a missing young lady go to school there, taking positions to work at the school to try to find her as like a last ditch effort. Their daughter has been missing for 3 years at the start of this book, and they're trying to locate her in a vast magical universe where magic doesn't solve every problem. So here they are at this magic school, and they're trying to find her, dealing with teenagers when they didn't think they'd be having to deal with a teenager outside of their own. So it throws them off guard, and just their worlds are in turmoil because they're in settings that they're not used to.
Sounds interesting. So, what were your reasons or inspirations for writing the book?
So initially my inspiration came from a original character I made on an old Harry Potter RPG form where you would type posts back and forth to each other. And that's where the initial idea came from. I wanted a girl and family with magic. So the story evolved quite a bit from there because originally there were narratives where some of the characters were different. So originally the story came from a different character's perspective, a younger character's perspective. And in the rewrites, eventually it came clear that we didn't that I didn't like it coming from a student's perspective. I wanted it to come from a direct perspective of the parents who are missing their daughter and trying to find her. Because I felt that number one, it was more gripping and it compelled me more. We see lots of stories about teenagers trying to discover things or find missing friends or pets or missing books or the like. But how many stories do you see where it's parents missing their child trying to find them in a magical setting?
Yeah, that's what attracted me about the book the most is that it deals with a real world problem in a fantasy setting. So, how did you juxtapose both of those?
Um, it took a great deal of thinking to be able to carefully plan out how to do this without being offensive to, different people groups and trying not to be triggering to any people with the content because it is sensitive content. You're talking about a young girl missing, and you're talking about depression and dealing with the emotional issues. You're talking about a marriage that's falling apart because their lives were turned upside down. You're talking about the strain of their adult friendships because what do you say to the couple whose daughter is missing? Oh, I'm so sorry, but move on. I mean, and it's about the process and timeline of grief and how it's not linear.
Yeah, um, that's what I found interesting about it because a lot of the when you deal with missing persons, you find them more in thrillers, and so I thought it was an interesting take on it for a fantasy book.
Well, thank you. And so a lot of it came just from, like I said, the Harry Potter RPG and wanting a character or characters that were set in a magical universe to deal with real world problems. So found that it was difficult in some ways to compose the two together because how do you balance that out? How do you balance out what magic should solve and what magic shouldn't solve? And so for this, it was a lot of trial and error to figure out, well, how do you answer these questions? Why couldn't they just wave their wand or smack a staff on the ground and suddenly be where their daughter was at, if she was even still alive? And how could they find that out? How could they find these details out?
Hmm.
So, there's a lot of big question marks in the air, and it took a lot to figure out, the kind of exchange system that magic would cost, and that, for every spell, there's a spell that will counteract it, so to speak. So you could say, okay, well, they could just scry to see their daughter. They could bring up this ginormous post or something. And that's not the case, because for what they can do, the person who took their daughter could equally do something to block them.
Oh, that's a good way to work out the difficulties. So tell us a little bit about the characters. What are their personalities? What are they like?
Okay, so one of the lead characters is Sabine Thornton. She can be sassy and sarcastic. She's insanely smart, and she's a talented healer. But she lost focus on her career when her daughter was born. Her life revolved around her daughter. She did some minor things in the community. She went to seminars and things before her daughter went missing. But then after her daughter was missing, her entire world collapsed, and she just closed in on herself. So she doesn't have much of what anybody could call a personality. When we first meet her, she's got a low affect. She's down. She's worried. She's snapping at friends and family because her daughter is still missing. She hasn't found her. She hasn't found any solid links. And the one that she did find, the one that leads to the school, puts her in direct contact with people her daughter's age, with young girls and young guys, and perhaps even some of the friends that their daughter had when she was still at home. So it makes it difficult for her because she's not prepared for that kind of emotional commitment to anybody.
Okay, and what about the father character?
The father character is somebody who is more fun loving. He tries to keep his sense of humor about him in different ways. He tries to keep a level head, and he's the one who keeps them going. He's the one who's been out searching on leads the most. He's the one who's been her encourager and her stable rock. So while Sabine has closed in on herself and been pretty awful at times, he's the one who's maintained some semblance of sense about himself and tries to keep them moving forward, even if it's not always the most sensitive. I mean, he tries to be sensitive to Sabine and what they're going through. Jackal is a very stable character, very, very balanced, I think. I think that he brings a lot to the story. And honestly, he was probably one of the more fun to write. Sabine was difficult because I could tap into her because I understand the struggles of depression and grief. Jackal was a little bit harder to tap into because he's got a personality that's even opposite mine. He's fun and outgoing. He's extroverted and he can be loud, and he's not ashamed of who he is. He's confident and, self-assured, but he's not arrogant. He's one of the nice guys.
Well, they sound like an interesting dynamic. So, what is your setting? I mean, it's urban fantasy, obviously, but is it set in the real world with magic, extra magic world, or is it a different world entirely?
Okay, so technically we're set in the real world, but we're on what's called a gate world. It's Lystone, and that's the school that they start to go to, where Sabine becomes a professor and where Jackal becomes a security guard. And in that setting, they can go to like Earth, and there are places that are like Earth. And eventually, with later books, we do explore different worlds, but mostly we take place in two areas. We take place at Lystone, and we take place at Tinsworthy. Tinsworthy is where they start. That's where their home is, and it's basically like a gate world itself, and it's Christmas basically all the time. It's snowy. It has like two seasons. It has autumn and winter. So mostly a snowy town, lots of little mom and pop stores, little Christmas train that goes around, things like that. So it's just a nice little place, and that's where they've settled their home. They have a home that's tucked back in the woods away from people, and so that's where they live. Then there's Lystone, which is the school. And the school's gate world connects to some other areas like a university and then a like grade school. So Lystone would be what you consider almost like a high school. And then there's a land bridge, that's what I call it in my story, that basically goes across the expanse of space to where these other areas are. And it's connected to several different villages where they can do shopping and where some houses are set up and other things like that.
Sounds interesting. So, what was the hardest scene for you to write in the book, or the type of scene?
Um, the hardest scene to write was probably in the resolution of the book, because it was difficult to tie everything in together and to still keep that rising action. It was during the rising action, it was like, okay, we've kind of reached the peak, but how do we, plateau this out and then start the fall of the action? And so that's where I found the most difficulty, was in getting the characters to do the rise and plateau and then the fall into the rest of the book. That's where I found it most difficult to write. It was a challenge to tap into that because you're at this insane height and then you drop.
Yeah, it's the climax is always hard. It's sometimes tricky to get right. All right. So, what was your favorite scene to write in the book?
My favorite scene to write in the book was one of the scenes near the middle. There's this big ball that's thrown. And we've got these two characters that are getting ready to set up for the ball. They're hanging decorations. It's a student and professor. They're the main ones that were signed up. There were some other people signed up, but these two are perfectionists. And so they're working together and they're just having some light banter. And they go up and they sit in this little balcony area and they look out this window. And the professor tells the student about how there have been days when she's thrown some of the other students' papers out the window and then had to go get them because they were just so awful. And that was just my most favorite scene to write, to be honest, because it wasn't something that I had planned, but just following the natural progression of the characters. They were just talking about different things they had gone through at the school. And she's like, yeah, I've sat here and I've thrown papers out the window because they've just been so awful.
That's so funny. Okay, so what about your secondary characters? Are any of them a little quirky or like to steal the scenes?
Yes, there are a couple that are very quirky. We've got a young teenage boy in there, Lion, and he wears these big aviator frames, and he's a player, and he really hits it off with talking to Jackal. And Jackal is not a player. He's been very devoted to his wife and his relationship ever since they met. They were high school sweethearts. And he's talking to this boy who's bragging about his conquest. He's like, number one, I don't need to hear that. Number two, you shouldn't be running around. And the interaction between them, it's just a lot of fun. He likes to steal the scenes when he comes onto the scenes because he's just like that guy. He's that kind of popular guy, but he's very quirky and kind of nerdy at the same time. And he just like says what he thinks as soon as it comes to his mind. There's no filter. So if he wants to talk about his latest conquest, he'll blurt out whatever about it. And, he just goes on with it. And everybody else is just left going like, what did you just say? What just came out of your mouth?
I bet he's fun to write.
Oh, he is, because his lines don't have to be as scripted as some of the others, because when he comes into the scene, since he just blurts out what comes to mind, he might blurt out, man, I really like Oreos. In the middle of this really serious moment, everybody else might be talking like about finals, and he'll just blurt out something that's crazy, and it'll just cause everybody to stop and look at him. And sometimes he'll get laughter, and sometimes it'll be like, "Are you as big of an idiot as you sound like?"
Okay, so on a more serious note, what are your characters afraid of?
Um, when it comes to Sabine and Jackal, their biggest fear is not finding their daughter. Even more so than not getting closure. I mean, their hope is that she's still alive, but they have no proof that she is. So, for them, it's not finding her.
Okay, so you obviously write fantasy, but are there any other genres that you'd like to try in the future?
Yes, I want to dip my toes into some romance. Uh, kind of want to dip my toes a little bit more into the paranormal. I'm actually working on a standalone book right now. At least that's all I plan for it to be at this moment, is a standalone book about a vampire who begins teaching at a college. So I enjoy dabbling in different genres, and I like flipping them on their heads.
Oh, well, that sounds like something to look forward to. So I think we'll wrap it up here, and I'll let you tell everyone where they can find you and your books.
All right, so you can find me on Amazon as A.R. Harlow, and the book title is We Must Find Her. It is the first book of the Finding Chronicles. Book 2 is slated to come out a little bit later this year. Right now, it's in the hands of the editor. You can also find me on Facebook as A.R. Harlow, and you can find me on Twitter as A.R. Harlow as well. Kind of dabble on Instagram. So basically, social media, I'm on it, but not very active anywhere except Facebook.
Okay, so thank you for being here. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
And you can find more Between the Pages book chats every weekend, so join us then. So that's all for now. Bye.